Prior to Entity Framework 5, there was no way to map properties that were defined as enums, regardless of whether you were using an EDMX file in the designer or code first to describe your model. Enum support was added to the core Entity Framework API in .NET 4.5, and as a result, Entity Framework now comprehends enums, both in the Entity Framework designer and in code first mappings. So you can define the enums either within the model or in your code. And really defining them within the model, as you'll see, is really just a roundabout way of defining them in code. But the designer has support for creating these enums. All right, and then what you do is once you create the enum, you define entity properties as the enum type. And that's what creates the link between the two. And I'll show you how to do all this. Now you can assign a single enum value to a property. Or you can assign multiple enum values using bitmaps. So you can set the flags attribute to enable this kind of functionality. But what it does is it lets you use bitwise operators with enum. So you can have multiple settings. All right, now only supports int16, int32, int64, byte, and short byte. Okay, so those are the only data types that you can use those with. And it's only available with .NET 4.5 and later versions. So as I mentioned, .NET 4.5 is where Microsoft included this functionality within Entity Framework, or put the infrastructure in place to be able to use it. All right, so as I mentioned, it works with database first or code first. For code first, you just define the enum in your project as usual, and then use it as the data type on the property of an entity class. And then Entity Framework takes care of the rest for you. And you should also know that the default type is int32, but you can change that to the other integer types. All right, so to show off enums, I'm going to use this person.person table. So the person is the schema, of course, and person is the table name. I'll go into the designer here. And you can see that there's this email promotion field. So let me raise this up, rearrange things a little bit here. Okay, so you can see that it's an integer. And Microsoft has very handily, or helpfully, included this description. And so what that says is that values are 0 means that the contact does not wish to receive email promotions. Actually, hover over it. 1 means that the contact does wish to receive email promotions from AdventureWorks. See if I can click that. That's a little bit easier to see. And then 2 means that contact does wish to receive email promotions from AdventureWorks and selected partners. So valid values are 0, 1, and 2. And we need to build into our application a way of ensuring that only those 3 values are inserted into the table there. And of course you could have constraints on the table and so forth. But this way we can handle errors within our application rather than sending the data to the database and having SQL Server have to send an error back that it's an invalid value. Okay, so that's the field that I'm going to use an enum with. But in particular, it's a prime candidate for an enum because it's an int, again of any size. It isn't a foreign key to a lookup table, and it has a small number of potential values. Okay, and there's lots of other places within the AdventureWorks 2012 database where you could use enums. All right, now I'm going to go back over to Visual Studio where I have this model that I built using AdventureWorks 2012. And here's that person table. So there's the email promotion. I'm going to right click on that and open up properties. And you can see that it's currently an int32. Okay. So at the moment, just based on the raw reverse engineering of the database, it's just the integer because it picked up that int data type from the database. Okay, so that shows that how using database first, initially the model sees the property as whatever type it discovered within the database, which makes sense. It doesn't have any smarts about what tables or entities you might want to use enums with. So then you have to go in and define the enum and then change the property's type definition to use that enum. Okay. Now, if you're using model first, I use database first for this model, but if you're using model first, you can set up the enum in advance. So if I had created this person table on an empty model or adding it to an existing model, I could go ahead, create the enum in code, set the data type here, and then it'll build the database correctly. Okay. Because it's going to pick up whatever data type I specify here, which again needs to be an integer, and it's going to create an int in the backend database. Okay, and then finally for code first, you just define the enum using .NET source code. Just define an enum in code like you typically would in C# or Visual Basic, and then use it as the type for a property of the entity class. Entity Framework sees that you're using an enum as that type, and then it does all the magic of hooking it all together. All right, now in this case, database first. There's a shortcut here. There's a few different ways of doing it, but the easiest way is to just come here, right-click on it, and select Convert to Enum. And that opens up this Add Enum Type dialog box. Now, I'm going to name this. I'm going to use a naming convention that I like, which is the name of the field and enum on the end. So that's a handy naming convention, but you can use whatever you want. If you want to call it Floyd, confuse other developers that don't know what Floyd is relative to the email promotion field, feel free. You're not limited. Okay, so the underlying type is int32. I'm going to retain that, but you can see the valid values are those lists that I talked about shortly ago. And now I need to define the values of this enum. Okay, so the first one is going to be no email, because remember, this is the option where the user didn't want any email from AdventureWorks. Now, value is optional. I don't have to supply these. If I don't, then it's going to do the regular thing of enums. The first value will be 0, the second will be 1, the third one will be 2. It'll increment one value with each new value that I add to the enum. But here's where, just kind of a personal thing, to make it clearer, because the database has explicitly set those values, I'm going to set them here. Even though it's a little bit redundant, that's kind of a way of enforcing that this is the way it's got to be. Because if somebody comes along in that code and shifts around those enums within the enum class that is going to be created here, then the values might shift. So this is going to make it explicit, a little bit clearer, and solve some kinds of maintenance problems. Okay, then the second option is AW email only. So they only want to get email from AdventureWorks. And then the third option here is all email. And that's a 2. Okay, now again, please understand that I didn't need to include the values there. If you really don't care, if these values have no intrinsic meaning to the application of the database, leave them off and they'll just be numbered in order. But I can also skip values as well. All right, there's a couple other options here that I can set. I can set the flags attribute. This is the option that I mentioned, that if I were going to use bitwise operations with these enum values, I could set that. And then I would have to change the values here. It would have to be like 0, 1, 2, 4, 8, and so forth. Some scheme like that. The other option is to reference an external type. Now, when I'm using the dialog box this way, what it's going to do is it's going to create a new enum for me, generate the code for it, and include it as part of the model. And so you can go to the model browser and see the definition of that code. But if I've already defined this someplace that's accessible to this application, in a reference project or within the application itself, I could use this reference external type. And then in that case, when I click OK, it's not going to create a new enum structure in the project. It's just going to reference that external type as the type of my email promotion field. Okay, but again, I want it to create a new type. I'm going to leave that blank. And of course, if I did select that, I would have to include the namespace in the type. And in this case, it would be the project name ssdemos.models or whatever the namespace is, and the name of the enum type. Okay, I'll click OK. And I also need to save my work once it's finished generating that. It's taking a few moments. All right, save that, because saving the change to the model is what actually generates the code. So if you make a change like this and don't find code within Solution Explorer, as I'm about to show you, then it may mean that you haven't saved the change and it hasn't generated the code yet. Okay, so let's go back over to email promotion and look at the properties again, and notice that it is now a type email promotion enum. And I can select that and notice that there's all different kinds of types that are now listed here. And I can go all the way to the bottom, and there's my awmodel.emailPromotion enum, because it is in fact actually part of this awmodel namespace. Okay, so the data type is now the enum. And then I'm going to go over here to Model Browser, select, and I'll collapse that. And notice that we have the enum types here, and we now have this email promotion enum. I'll double click on that, and I can open up the dialog box and make changes to that definition. Unfortunately, from the model browser, there's no easy way that I've found to get to the source code. So for that, I have to go over here to Solution Explorer. I'll collapse references. Everything is here in models. And I'll go to the awmodel.edmx, awmodel.tt, and then scroll down here to email promotion enum. So this is where it may not appear if you haven't saved the designer, like I was talking about a moment ago. Double click on that, and there you can see that enum. Now, theoretically, you could open this up, change the code, but you have to be careful with this because this is auto-generated, and as the message up here says, that any manual changes to the file may cause unexpected behavior in your application. So you need to make changes through that dialog box. Okay? So that way it'll be saved within any framework and it'll remember that change to that model. Okay. If it's something that you think you're going to need to change a lot, you should take it out of the model here and put it into a separate class within your models folder or into some other class file. So there's different ways of handling that kind of situation, but just by default, don't directly change this code here. Okay, and then one last important thing to point out is that the data type here is int. So that corresponds to the data type that I converted this to an enum from, and the underlying database type is int. The data type of the enum and the underlying data have to match. That's very important. You get all kinds of problems if it doesn't. Okay, so just a word to the wise there. Okay, and then the next thing I need to do is actually build the solution, because that'll compile the code and make it available within my code, IntelliSense, and so forth. So it'll take a few moments. Build succeeded. I didn't do anything to mess up the code, and now that enum is available for use. Okay, so now we have the enum, we've changed the model. Let's look at how you implement some code that uses this enum. And there's not going to be anything strange or magical here. It's just an enum that's a data type for a class as far as your .NET application goes. All right, so at this point, now what I need to do is start building out the MVC application. So I'm going to collapse some of this down, get into models, and I'm going to right-click on controllers and add a controller. If you're not familiar with an MVC application, this is the code that essentially receives requests from the user through the browser when they click on a link or take various actions. That has the code consisting of action methods that respond to some user action. And so it might be to call up another page, it might be to execute a query, populate some sort of class with data from the database, then send it to a view. The view is essentially an HTML template for how the data is presented to the user. You might redirect to an external website. Whatever you need to do in response to that user action and any error conditions that arise and so forth. Okay, so in this case I have a lot of options. I'm not going to use this MVC5 controller with views using Entity Framework. The reason is that that needs to be based on a specific object, but I'm doing kind of some custom things here. So I just want an empty MVC controller. I don't even want the empty read-write actions. if I was going to want to write a lot of code to interact with my own view model classes or other things, I could use that, and it would put in the skeletons of the action methods for a lot of the common operations that I would need to do. But I just want an empty MVC5 controller. And I'm following convention for this application, so I'm going to name this home controller. So this becomes the home page, the home controller, the default place where MVC looks for the action methods in order to respond to user requests. You can have other controllers, but then you have to specifically redirect to those controllers. Okay, add that. And there I have the empty controller. And as you can see, it's not really all that empty. I did get the default index action because you always need at least the index action method. You can rename it, but index is the default. So it's easiest, simplest to create MVC applications where you use the default names. Okay, so what happens with the index method is that it's going to display a list of links. And then from there, the links will then execute other action methods that do various things, the various techniques that I want to show you through this application. All right, now, throughout this code, I'm going to be using the models that I build into the application. So I'm going to add this shortcut for using ssdemos.models. Okay, so now I don't need to type out the full name of the model objects that I want to access. All right, the next thing I want to do is I'm going to be using the context object for the entity framework model that I built. I'm going to be using it throughout these action methods. So I'm going to define it in a variable outside of the action method. So it's available anytime this class comes into memory. All right, so this is called AW entities. And I'm just going to call it DB, the variable. And that's equal to a new AW entities. All right, so that instantiates that context object, makes it available to all of this code. All right, I'm also going to do a Control KD. That just kind of reformats the page a little bit, and Control S to save everything. So now all my tabs line up and all. Okay, so now it's time to add the first action method that is going to work with the entity model. And I'll come back to that index method shortly. Okay, so what I want to create here is a public method. It's going to return a type action result. So that's a class of objects, various kinds of objects that I can return from an action method. And in this case, I'm going to return a view, and a view is one of the action results that I can return. So I'm going to call this create person. And then I can write some code. Now what I'm going to do here, and I get the red squiggly because I haven't defined a return on this. I've specified that it returns something, but I don't have a return statement yet. All right, so what this code is going to do, it's going to create a new person object, and I'm going to use my own personal information, and adds it to the people entity set, which is an entity set object that was created as part of my entity data model. Now, it's not going to change the database, so I'm not going to save my information. I'm just not going to take the step of saving the changes. And then it's also going to display the number of people who have opted to receive all emails. So I'm going to use that enum in a couple different ways in this code. So I'm going to show you how you can assign the value of an enum to a property of that class, that person class, as well as use it as a filter on a link expression. Okay, so I'm going to instantiate a new person object, and I'm going to call it person. And it's a new person. And then I'm going to assign some properties. So I'm going to do person.personType. I'm just going to use a code. This is something from AdventureWorks 2012. Just means that it's a store client, was what SC means. Oops, helps to include equal signs. And then I'm going to set the name style to false. That just indicates that I want it in first, last name order, and there's various others that you can use within the AdventureWorks database. And then I'll set the first name to Don. And the last name to Kylie. spelling it correctly. That's a rarity in most databases. And then I'm going to set the email promotion. Now, first of all, notice that it's an iCollection of email addresses. Whoops. Email promotion, select that one, is an email promotion enum is the type on that. Okay, I'll hit tab, and I'll select enter, and it's prompting me. It sees that there's an enum. It's a data type enum, so all I have to do is press period, and I get those 3 different values. All right, I'm pretty easygoing, not in real life as far as junk mail goes, but I'm going to select to receive all email. And so presumably this is happening on a website. The user is signing up for a service and has checked the box saying, send me all kinds of junk email because I love junk email. So something like that is going on. Okay, and then there's a couple other required things that I need to do for the database. So is the row GUID. So I'm just going to new up a GUID here. Just take whatever that default GUID is. And then I also need to set the modified date. And I'll set that equal to date time now. Okay, so I've set all the required fields, and okay, squiggly went away, that's good. And now I need to add it to the people collection. And keep in mind that people is an entity set object that the Entity Framework wizard created for me. It's not a name that I changed. Entity Framework has some nice smarts as far as pluralization goes. Select people, and I want to use the add method, and I'll add that person to it. Okay, so now it's part of the collection. It's part of the data that is available. All right, at this point, normally I would also save the changes, but I don't want to persist it to the database, so I'm going to skip that step. Now I want to grab the information about how many people selected all emails. So I'm going to create a new variable called all email, and I'll reference the entity context object, and I want to go against people, that entity sent collection, and I want to filter it using the where clause on A goes into a.emailPromotion, okay, and set that equal to, using that enum value, it sees that the field is an enum type, and so it gives me that enum. And I want to specify all email. And so that's my where clause for the link expression. And then I'm also going to order the data, and I'll do it, P goes into P dot last name, P for person, can be any valid variable name that you want. And then by first name. Okay, so there's my link expression that uses that email promotion enum. All right, and then I also need to do something with this. I'm going to use the viewBag object. Again, if you're not familiar with MVC applications, this is an object that lets you quickly and easily dynamically create properties. It's a dynamic variable so that you can pass them to a view. It's automatically passed to the view. And so I'm going to create something called count and set that equal to the all email variable. All right, and then the last thing I need to do is return from this method. And in this case, because I'm returning an action result, I have to return an object of that type. I'm going to use the view method to return a view result, which derives from action result. And I'm going to pass the person object as my view model. So this is the object that is going to have the data that the view is going to create in order to, or use in order to create the page that is rendered to the user. Okay, so that's all the code I need to do. Now I'm going to create the view. I'll right click within this create person method. I'll add the view, and I'm going to use the same name as the action method. That's another convention over configuration. I could change it to something else, but then I have to do more work in order to redirect to the proper view. Now the template I want to use is details. I'm showing the information for just a single person, So I don't want to list it, I don't want to delete, I'm not going to allow the user to edit it in this particular application, so I'm going to use details. Then I need to specify the model class that I'm going to use. And in this case, I'm returning a person object, so I want that type to be person. And as you can see, it's in the SS Demos namespace in the Models folder. Okay? And then I also need to specify the data context class. I only have one. So this is, it's gone out, looked for all of the objects that implement the context object, or the DB context object. And I select that because it needs to know the top level entree into this model, because I can have multiple ones within the application. And then I'm going to accept all the defaults. I don't actually have a layout. Well, I sort of have a layout page. It's a pretty basic page. And I'll click on Add. And it goes out, looks at user reflection, looks at the members of that person object, and then creates a view that has most of the information. Most of the information that I want to display about this person object. Now, the person object in the AdventureWorks database has a lot of information that just is going to be clutter for this application. So I don't want to display to the user the person type. I could in some applications. Name style, title. I just want to get rid of a lot of this stuff, make it a lot easier. I do want to display the first name. Don't really care about the middle name, so I'll get rid of that. I'll display the last name. I won't worry about the suffix, because all I really want to show here is the email promotion. Oops, didn't delete quite enough of there. There we go. Get my mouse out of the way. So there's the email promotion, so it's going to display some value. And then I don't care about the email or the additional contact info, demographics, and so forth. So I'll kind of scroll down here. Row GUID ID. I could include modified date and all that. Don't really care about all that. So I'm going to get rid of most of this. This is just noise. Really don't want to display the password hash. Okay, so now I have a much simpler page that's just displaying the important information that is important to my users. Now scroll back up here and notice that I made this a strongly typed view, and so it's using that ssdemos.models.person object. Again, person was created as part of that data model that I created. All right, then the one last thing I need to do is I don't need these links at the bottom because I'm not going to allow them to link. I don't have a master list, just a very simple application. But I do want to display that count. So I'm just going to say number opting for all email. And then I'm going to reference that view bag and that count property that I added to it. And I'll convert it to a string because I want to format it. And I'll format it using basically 1,000 separators and no decimal points. Okay, so there's the page. So once again, using that person object that's being returned by this home controller, so I created it in code here. It has all the properties and everything. All I did here is I assigned properties for the required fields as well as that email promotion that I want to look at. And then I added it to the collection, and then I searched the collection for everyone that is displaying all email. And I passed the email to the count, and then the view takes all that data, takes that object, uses that model object to display it on the page, and then I also am using that count property of the view bag. All right, there's one other thing that I need to do is create that index view as well. So I'll come over here, right click on it, add view. In this case, I'm going to once again leave the name as the default because then MVC knows where to find it. This time I want an empty model because I'm just going to put some links on it. And leave the defaults. I'll click on add. It creates that index.cs HTML. And of course, if you created this project in Visual Basic, it would be VB HTML. You can do everything I'm showing you in Visual Basic as well. And now what I want to do is add a link to that action method so that it executes. The user can click on it and that method executes. All right, to do that, I'm going to use another HTML helper method. Helps to spell it correctly. And in this case, action link. And then what I can do is specify the prompt. So this is my enums demo, so I'm specifying enums. and I'm going to create a new person. So that's the text that the user will see. The action method that I want to execute is create person. And that's all the required fields that I need for this. All right, I'll save everything I did. And I'll run the application. And there you can see I'm running the home controller, the index action method, which displays this empty view that I added the link to. I'll click on that enums, create a new person, and I get an exception. Okay, let's see. An overload for method toString takes 1 arguments. Okay, that's a little bit odd. Yes, it does. toString, quote. That all looks good. So this is an integer. That should convert it to a string. Back over at home controller. Ah, that's the problem. Okay, let me stop execution here. So what this link expression did is that it's using the where clause here in order to filter the set of people where the email promotion is all in email, as I explained, ordering by last name, ordering by first name. And so this is going to return a collection, essentially an entity set of people. Now I could include the count method here, or I could include it on the all email variable. So I'm going to add it there. The problem is that I was returning a collection of people, a rather large collection, but I wanted to return just the count. So I'm going to use the count method there. Oops, count method. And save that change. Okay, that should solve the problem. So I'm going to run it again. And going to the home, create on the link. And this time we get that page. So I'm displaying those 3 pieces of information that I left in the item. And notice that it's giving me the text form of the email promotion enum. And then as you can see here, there's 3,770 users in the database, as well as the new record that I just created, but I didn't save to the database, that have that all email setting set. So there's how you can use an enum within an MVC, a .NET application that you defined as part of the model.